So, good evening, everyone. Welcome to a brand new episode of T2NZ's Middle East Chronicler on the MENA region's commitment to net neutrality and a carbon-free environment. Joining us today is the co-founder of AirCarbon, Mr. William Pazos, who is joining us from the States. Mr. Pazos is the co-founder and managing director of AirCarbon Exchange, a frictionless carbon exchange offering the lowest fees in the industry, and an architecture which will allow the carbon market to expand efficiently and fulfill its true potential in helping the world to meet net zero. Mr. William is a senior climate finance and renewable energy expert with a proven track record developing, financing, and managing projects in Asia, Latin America, and Africa. Previously, he was a managing director at Standard Bank. In this capacity, he was the global head of carbon origination and finance, as well as the member of the board of Standard Merchant Bank, Singapore. As the CEO and founding partner of EcoInvest Carbon SA, a joint company with Bunge SA, he built what became one of the largest aggregator of carbon credits. In his early career, he was a bond trader at JP Morgan Chase in New York, as well as a partner at Dartley, a large emerging markets fixed income fund. Thank you so much for taking the time and joining us, Mr. Pazos.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you, sir. So to begin with, since our theme for this fortnight is sustainable smart cities, my first question to you is, think AirCarbon Exchange can lead from the front when it comes to enabling cities to become more sustainable?
Well, I think that carbon markets bring to the table is that they smooth out the transition from polluting technologies to non-polluting technologies. Because it's very difficult to, as we say in the US, turn on a dime. So change the paradigm very quickly, because infrastructure is sort of a heavy investment, a heavy lift to change. So what carbon does is allows for that transition, right? So it attracts capital into new technologies by the promise of being able to sell the future carbon credits. And it also sort of allows companies and entities within different cities to mitigate their emissions against a baseline. By using carbon credits, they can reduce their emissions and give themselves more time to readjust, right? So that's, I think, our main contribution, right? A real price signal of what carbon costs is the most important feature that we bring to the table.
So which brings me to my second question. According to you, what are the key challenges facing the MENA region specifically that continue to be an active hurdle in making all the cities here sustainable?
Well, I think that what the MENA region is struggling with, and what literally everyone across the globe is struggling with, is that we're saddled with a technological park or a technology infrastructure that's somewhat outdated given our current climate emergency. And so what everybody's struggling with is, how do we basically get out of the old and bring in the new? It's not an easy thing to do, right? So when you look at the MENA region in particular, there's a lack of potential transition points, right? So there's a heavy dependence on oil because there's a heavy abundance, and like it or not, a lot of options that are available to us now, they have become a lot more competitive. But they still require a huge amount of storage in order to compete with fossil fuel. So transitioning fully to renewables in the region is a very difficult thing to do because it relies heavily on storage. That's a simple example of what makes things very difficult.
Right. And so before we can move to the nitty-gritty of AirCarbon, could you tell us more about your presence in the MENA region currently, and maybe a little bit about your current projects there?
So we're based in Abu Dhabi. We're in the process of becoming a fully regulated exchange and clearinghouse in Abu Dhabi, which, by the way, is a very interesting thing in the sense that carbon everywhere else in the world, other than Abu Dhabi, is considered an intangible commodity, and so it's actually not a regulated commodity. So Abu Dhabi is actually the only place globally that requires carbon exchanges to become regulated, which we sort of embrace wholeheartedly. We think a regulatory framework around carbon will enhance the carbon markets. So we've got all our technical team is based out of Abu Dhabi. We have a full sort of a full team that's looking at projects in Africa. We're looking at projects in the larger Gulf region, and they basically involve bringing carbon credits from projects that are mitigating carbon activities in the region.
Right. So given this background, could you tell us a little bit about AirCarbon tokens and why this is of potential value to investors?
So the idea of AirCarbon is that we are looking to bring traditional commodities architecture to the carbon markets, right? So what does that actually mean? If you look at carbon credits today, the majority of them trade on a one-to-one basis, no different than a painting, right? So someone would offer you carbon credits and you would ask them questions about, well, where did the carbon credit come from? What country? Where is the registry? When was it done? You know, all these other questions. And it's impossible to scale a market if you're trading one painting at a time, right? If you look at traditional commodities, the way they work is they all sit in a warehouse, and what trades on the exchange are digital receipts. So we created that for the carbon markets. That was our contribution. So instead of having a physical warehouse, we create a trust. We define the kind of carbon credits that are eligible to go into the trust. So there'll be something like, you know, only aviation credits approved by the International Civil Aviation Organization can be put into this trust. And then we create a digital receipt on the exchange, which is called a CET. And now you can trade the CET. So you want to buy a carbon credit that's eligible under the International Aviation Scheme, you buy it CET. You want to buy a carbon credit that's eligible, that gives you exposure to, let's say, global forestry, you buy our GNT. Global nature token. So that's what we brought to the table. That's how we work.
And it's very interesting because there was this line that was on AirCarbon Exchange, the website, when I was reading through, and it said, especially with regards to carbon developers, the current marketplace for the sale of carbon offsets is highly fragmented and inefficient for project developers. Now, why do you think this is the case, and how can this actually be resolved in real time?
Well, that's what we're trying to do, right? We're trying to sort of bring order to the market. So right now, it's a market that has grown from what we call the voluntary carbon markets, which was, you know, a fraction of the $1 billion mark that we hit this year in terms of size of the market, right? So it needs to grow. It's a natural progression. You know, contracts need to standardize, and it's still sort of grappling with the legacy of carbon trading on a one-to-one basis, as I said, as paintings. It's just a matter of time.
And when it comes to cap and trade programs, the total limit on pollution credit declines over time. So that gives corporations an incentive to find cheaper alternatives. Now, how do you believe this affects the net zero goal in the long term?
Well, we need to use all the tools in our arsenal in order to fight climate change. That includes a carbon tax. That includes carbon trading, cap and trade. It includes, pretty stringent legislation, government incentives. We need to use literally every single weapon we have in our arsenal in order to try and not get to that tipping point where we will have a climate disaster on our hands. So what we contribute is, more than anything else, is a price of carbon, right? Because the problem with carbon is that it's not visual, and so people don't. They even corporates, when they create a product, they don't factor in the cost of carbon, right? Because it's not a tangible. There's not a direct result between their action and climate. There's a big lag, right? The molecules go into the atmosphere, and we don't really see global warming happen immediately after you build a car. So it's very important for the market to attach a cost of carbon to all human activity, and that's the direction we're moving in.
Right. That makes a lot of
I'm
sense.
jumping in. Apologies, Catherine. I'm sorry. I'm jumping in here. So, Mr. Pazos, the question I ask is, how soon do you expect the cost of carbon to get? How soon do you expect to see in some market somewhere in the world for it to become a reality? Because this is not going to be a regulation that's going to be welcomed by any industry easily. You're fighting a battle on both the government front as well as on battle for capitalism, because nobody wants their product cost to go up.
Well, I wouldn't actually agree with that statement. There's significant pressure on all sides of the argument, right? So you have in the European market, you have the European emission trading scheme with a clear price of carbon, at around 90 euros per ton, and corporations have to deal with this. You have in the United States, the Securities and Exchange Commission just a couple of weeks ago basically announced that corporates that are making net zero commitments have to, by law, produce carbon accounting and demonstrate that they're doing tangible activities that move them towards their commitment. You hear all of these companies saying that they're going to be net zero by whatever year. If a publicly traded company says so, then that publicly traded company is not doing anything other than just grabbing the headline. That's fraud, and that's stock manipulation. So there's pressure on the market from pretty much every direction for this to happen. So I don't necessarily agree that it's an uphill battle.
And how soon do you expect or anticipate that this will become, at least one government somewhere is going to make this a tangible regulation?
Well, you have the European community that's made it a completely tangible legislation. You have South Africa with a carbon tax, as well as a scheme that allows to be paid using carbon credits generated by projects. You have a very recent announcement in Singapore for a carbon tax regime. You have a similar carbon tax regime in Mexico being announced. There's an existing one in Colombia. There's an existing one in Korea. There's an existing one in New Zealand, in Australia, with the ACCUs in the market. So it's happening, and I paraphrase. I can't quote him, but Larry Fink, in one of his famous letter to CEOs, I think it was about 2 years ago, he said, if you're in the board of the company and you are not addressing climate change as a risk for your company, you're being negligent. This is a very real risk for companies going forward, and something that they should be managing very actively.
Sounds good. Thank you very much.
Right. And before I can continue with my questions for the benefit of those tuning in, this is me, Catherine Abraham, your host at 32NZ, in conversation with Mr. William Pazos, the co-founder of AirCarbon Exchange, on AirCarbon Exchange's contribution to sustainable smart cities in the MENA region. So, sir, taking it forward from there, since we've just had a talk on legislation, under the Kyoto Protocol, if a country emits less than its target amount of hydrocarbons, it could actually sell its surplus credits to countries that did not achieve its Kyoto level goals through an emission reduction purchase agreement, or an ERPA. Now, what are your views around the ERPA and how practical is it?
Well, an ERPA is no different than an ISDA agreement, right? It's a purchase and sale agreement. It's a document that basically says that someone is buying and someone is selling an emission reduction. It's just a contract. What we do is, by doing the tokenization, we sort of securitize the credits and allow them to trade very quickly. In other words, when the word trade, actually all it means is that someone's buying and someone's selling, right? So we sort of we do away with the need for an ERPA. So the ERPA is an instrument that that has its place in transactions where they are where they're bilateral, but they go by the wayside if you do transactions on an exchange platform.
And now, for the benefit of those who employ the policy of caution, we must include this question, and that is, there is a tinge of uncertainty at times in the minds of potential first-time investors on the workability of these carbon credits. Do you have a message for them?
Well, I think that what you need to think of is that there are certain registries out there that are credible, that have been around for a long time, that operate under, strict integrity rules, a lot of transparency, and those would include the likes of BIRA, which is the largest of the registries in the voluntary space, as well as Gold Standard. Those are examples of entities that issue carbon credits of extremely high quality. So there's something very important that people need to understand. There's a very clear signal in the market that tells you if you're buying something good or not, and its price. Nowhere more than in the carbon markets. If you're looking at a carbon credit that's being traded at about $3 a ton, it's probably not of the sort of, it's not going to stand sort of the quality test. But if you're trading something north of $10 and there's a clear price signal for that, then you know that there's a lot of rigor behind it.
Right. So circling back right from where we started from. So how would you define a sustainable smart city? What are the parameters for a city to be called an effective, sustainable smart city?
Well, I think the absolute first thing that you need in order to start the journey of calling yourself a smart city is a baseline, right? So you need to know where you're at all points in time. So I don't think that you can sort of put the mantle of being a smart city because you're greening your parks. That's a very cheap way of grabbing headlines. I think it has to be a scientific approach. I think you need, as a city, it needs to have a baseline calculation that says, okay, this is where I am today. and then it needs to set a target and a horizon, and then have actionable items in between those two. So that to me defines a sustainable smart city, right? Because once you've created those 2 points, the beginning and the end, falling into place, right? You start looking for alternatives in terms of transportation. You look at legislating energy efficiencies and promoting energy efficiency. All of those activities that you would expect to see in a smart city, then all of a sudden become sort of coalesce around a strategy, and that for me is the ultimate smart city.
Excellent. So our last question. So if you had to advise the Middle East governments and the private players, in fact, on improving one key strategy today that accelerates the reduction of carbon emissions, what would it be and why?
I think for me, it's doing everything in their power to create a visible price of carbon, right? So make it so that people know that every single time that you emit carbon, there's a price attached to it. So by creating some kind of a carbon tax, by creating some kind of a cap and trade scheme, or a combination of both, you're sending to the market a very strong price signal. And that tends to change human behavior and have, in my mind, the best outcome for cities.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Mr. William, and for connecting with us, for taking out the time. I know you've got a very, very busy schedule, sir, but thank you so much for joining us. And we deeply appreciate you taking the time out for this interview.
All right. Thank you very much. It was a real pleasure.
Thank you very much.
Thank you also. Thank you to my viewers for tuning in. And please keep tuning in to all our subsequent episodes from now. I do hope that Mr. Pazos' insights and thoughtful answers would have inspired you just as much as it has inspired us. For now, I take your leave. This is me, Catherine Abraham, for 32 Net Zero, signing off.